Today I've travelled to Lytham St Anne's and I've been attending the Probe UK Paranormal and UFO Conference, and I'm delighted to speak with Charles Hall, who is a Vietnam vet. He has a master's in nuclear physics and he has had some phenomenal experiences in Nevada. Charles, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Now, I would just ask viewers to keep an open mind when listening to Charles. He's a very eloquent man, as we found out yesterday when we listened to his talk. Now, if you just start with your, because you were a weather observer, could you tell us what that's about and why do we need weather observers?
Well, thank you for having me on your show. I enlisted in the U.S. Air Force in July 1964, and making a very long story short, I became a weather observer. I was trained to be a weather observer. In the 60s, before the internet and computers, you had to have a person actually go out and measure the winds and look at the clouds and send in wind reports. My job, and plot up weather maps and so on. I was stationed at Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada, outside Las Vegas, Nevada, and from 1965 till May of 1967. And of that time, I spent most of it at the Indian Springs gunnery ranges, northwest of Nellis. They're like 90 miles. Nevada is a big stretch of desert, and it was out in the Indian Springs Valley, which is a desert valley covered with mountains. I discovered that as the weather observer, it was my duty to get up at 3 in the morning and go out to drive out into the desert and release a weather balloon and track it and phone the winds into Nellis. I discovered that at the north end of Indian Springs Valley there is a base that the U.S. Air Force has for extraterrestrials. I named those extraterrestrials the Tall Whites. I described that 2-year stretch that I was out there in my 4-book series, which I've entitled Millennial Hospitality. I have a website, millennialhospitality.com. I'm also millennialhospitality.org, and which has pictures and more information. And the books can be purchased anywhere in the world through Amazon.com or at any bookstore. I tried, in my books, I'm not trying to prove that the extraterrestrials are real. For the first 6 months that I came across them, I thought I was nuts. I refused to accept that I was looking at real flesh and blood creatures who had come here from some planet orbiting a distant star. And so even with them standing in front of me, I found it hard to accept. Took me 6 months to get over the terror and the shock, and what I'm trying to describe in my books is how it felt. I'm trying to describe how that felt for 2 years to go out into the desert knowing that you weren't going to be alone, or having the extraterrestrials come into my barracks at Indian Springs. It was a very tiny base. And, waking up at night with them there. After 2 years, I stopped questioning myself and made friends with a few of them. Each one of them is individuals, just like humans. Their skin is as white as a piece of paper. They have large blue eyes, and throughout most of their life they stand as tall as we do. I describe all that in my books. They have men, women, and children. And you'd talk, most of the time when you were talking with them, I was talking about very ordinary things, such as if I was talking with the young mothers, they were interested in women's fashions, and I had mail order catalogs for Montgomery Wards and Sears and so on, and many times, or if I was talking about their children, about how healthy their children were. So they weren't. It was what I'm trying to capture in my books is the shock of it all. I'm also trying to capture the difference between talking with the extraterrestrials and talking with my experiences with my guardian angels. So the books have more than just extraterrestrial things in them. When I was in Vietnam, my good friend Kenneth E. Baker from LaPorte, Texas, willingly gave his life to keep me alive. And so in book 3, there's a large section where I try to capture how that felt, how it was with Baker. It was a very religious experience for him to come and say that that he knew in advance that he was going to die to keep me alive. So they're a very emotional series of books.
So Charles, I just want to ask you about the actual base. So
Yes.
presumably this base was provided by US Black Ops under kind of a veil of secrecy, is that?
When you're on the public highway at Indian Springs, Nevada, which everyone can find in the maps, and as my website shows, when you look north up the valley, there's a group of mountains that are like 45, 50 miles up there. The base is dug in on those mountains, and the Air Force runs that whole section of desert. It's the back door to Area 51. However, it is not itself. It's inside the Area 51 perimeter, but you know, you can the valley is very long, and as you see on the map, very wide, and it's at the northern end of that valley. They've been there for a very long time. The tall whites live much longer than we do. The tall whites live, I estimate, 600 to 800 years. They live about 10 times longer than we do. But they don't age the way we do. When they get to be equivalent to a human, about 40, instead of showing the effects of age, they start growing again. So that throughout most of their life, they're the same height I am, 5'11", but they're all individuals, so there's variation. But then as they get older, they get very tall. I've seen them more than 8.5 and 9 feet tall, but the very old ones get very fragile because their organs do not grow in the same proportion as their skeleton and their muscles. Eventually they get so old and so tall that their organs can no longer support their body and they die of old age. This is not necessarily the benefit you would think, because their body doesn't heal as fast as we do. They're very frail. And like if we fell down and broke a leg, we might be up and about in a month or so, or 6 months, maybe in a bad case a year. But see, if they fell down and broke their leg, they would easily be 5 Earth years before you could see much healing at all. Right. One morning when I was out in the desert, after I'd become friends with a few of them, because they're all individuals, and so, you know, there were people who trusted me and I trusted, and there were people that I'm still terrified of. They're generals. So you had to be very specific about which ones you were interacting with. But one time I scratched myself in the morning, and I was young and healthy in those days, and by the afternoon I was healing up. It had already scabbed over, and I was no longer wearing a Band-Aid or anything. And a group of them came around, and they knew that I had scratched myself in the morning, and seeing that I was already healed in the afternoon, they were shocked. One of the tall white lady visitors was asking their guard, "Are all humans like this?" And their guard was saying, "Yes, they appear to be." And whereas for them, see, that would have been a month just healing up an ordinary scratch. Quite all right.
So you actually named 2 other races. Would you have any idea as to the numbers of tall whites that are at this base?
I don't have any precise numbers, but as I describe in Book 3, in 1966, when the tall white lady, whose CIA name was or whose name that she used for humans was Pamela, when she was trying to pass her final exam to be in the technology transfer program, her final exam required that she walk up to me with all of their instruments turned off and meet me on my terms. And of course this was after I'd gotten over my fear of them, and to prove that she was meeting me on my terms, she had to turn her back to me and walk around me with her back to me to
Right.
prove that she trusted me. And she was terrified of humans. She was terrified of me, as I describe in Book 3. On that night, I estimate there were between 200 and 500 tall white individuals, men, women, and children, watching her from the mountains to the east, along with several U.S. Air Force generals. and a couple of humans in business suits that I suppose were from the Department of Defense. And so the number of tall whites, while not in the millions, could easily be several thousand, or certainly several hundred. A deep spacecraft would the large deep spacecraft, they came in several sizes, would carry as many people as a cruise liner for the Mediterranean or for the Caribbean. And so it wouldn't be unusual for there to be 200 or 300 of them get off a deep spacecraft, although the most I ever actually counted on a deep spacecraft was somewhere between 70 and 90.
Okay. Now, you mentioned technology transfer, and you said in your talk that the agreement was that we provided them with a base in exchange for some of their technology.
That's correct.
And do you know what technology that they imparted to the...
No, I don't. See, I was the weather observer. I was never, I wasn't part of any design program, or I was not part of any reverse engineering program. I was not briefed before I went out there. I was not debriefed. The agreement was that anything I did, that everything I did would never be classified. Weather information is never classified. I understand that during the Korean War, for example, the Americans and the Red Chinese routinely exchanged hourly weather reports all through the Korean War because it's never classified.
All right.
And see, when I was out there, I had to, everything I learned about them, I had to learn by either observing them or by talking with them. And they never came to teach me anything. They came for their purposes. A common one, about half of the time, was that the mothers would have children who liked to play. I'm the weather observer. I have pretty colored balloons. I release them with lights on at night. I track them. The children loved to come and play where I was. Here on Earth, we can see the stars at night, but I understand that on their home planet, it's bigger than the Earth, and the atmosphere is denser. Night is rare. And I understand that on their home planet, they cannot see the stars at night. One of the things they love to do is to walk around the Indian Springs Valley at night and just look at the stars. Well, they considered it to be an extremely beautiful place. Their home planet is apparently a warm desert-like planet without oceans, but with only large lakes. And see, when they came to where I was, if there was no reason for them to talk with me, they wouldn't. They might just show up with the children might just play, and they might go away and never say good evening, goodbye, we're going, anything. They were that way. They were far more quiet than, say, what you might have expected. They really didn't feel like telling me anything. I mean, I was an enlisted man. I had only 2 stripes and later 3. They knew very well that I was just an enlisted man. If they've ever forgot that, the American generals would be happy to prove it by having me clean a few latrines, show who was given the orders. And so they never came to discuss policy or anything. They came for their purposes. Now, as part of the technology exchange program, they needed they're naturally more afraid of us than we are of them. That when they come here, they have to learn to overcome their fear of us. And see, from their point of view, it was nice to have Charlie out there, the expendable human, I guess. And then see, they could practice talking with me and overcoming their fear of humans before they went off to talk to the quality folk, to the people who mattered. According to my logbooks, the 7 years before I was there, more than 41 American airmen were stationed out there as weather observers, each in turn. And every one of them had become compromised. Some of them were so terrified of the ranges, they would not go out to take the weather report. They would simply make them up from the barracks. There were piles of weather reports sent in from Indian Springs that were not worth the paper they were written on. One of the things I'm proud of is that I always went out and took the weather report, even though many nights I was, especially early on, I was absolutely terrified.
Right. So Charles, it's obviously quite a large facility with, as you describe, possibly thousands of beings there. How is this whole program kept secret from the American public and the world? I mean, would it not leak out into media and become a sensational story? How do they manage to keep this under wraps, such a huge secret?
One time It's far easier than what you might think, because people don't expect that. Don't expect that. I wouldn't say there were thousands at the base all the time. The base was used like an airport, and so, you know, when the deep spacecraft would come in, they would be in port for 2 weeks, and the people would get off while the deep spacecraft was being repaired and refueled and refurbished. So the number at the base might vary from as little as the base personnel, perhaps 50, 60 people, to a much larger number, perhaps 1,000. But there was not a lot of people there. But keeping it secret was so easy. One time, my orders were that nobody could ask me any questions. My own commander couldn't. He wasn't told. Only the highest ranking generals knew what was actually up the valley. One time I was trying to tell one of my friends who knew that something was out there. He was one of the maintenance men at Indian Springs, and a few of the maintenance men did know they were out there. But he was one that knew they were out there. He later died in Vietnam. And he looked at me like I was nuts. Another time I was trying to explain to one of my friends down at Nellis, who knew there was something unusual about the valley. I was trying to explain to him what they were. That they were out there. And he thought that I was drunk. He thought that when I went out, and he, instead of actually listening to what I was saying, as a friend, he cautioned me, saying, remember, you have to be sober when you go out there, you know, just for safe driving. And he you know, he thought that instead of there being actual extraterrestrials out there, he thought that I'd just been out there having a beer party or something. So, you know, you didn't have to keep it a secret. You didn't have to do anything. Nobody believed me anyway. Yeah.
All right, and Charles, and now we hear of people who do try and break their official secrets act by telling people what they've seen in black programs. So, you know, is your life not under threat by what you're saying?
The agreement they had with the Tall Whites, as I describe in my books, was that nothing I did would ever be secret. I'm not whistleblowing or anything. When I wrote the books, all I was trying to do was to capture how emotional it was for me and pass it on to my children and my grandchildren. In the books, I'm not arguing any government policy. I'm not advocating any change in whatever the government thinks is appropriate. I'm not even claiming to know all about the program. I'm just trying to capture my experiences in those 2 years, in those 2 years, and with the Tall Whites and with the extraterrestrials that I call the Norwegians with 24 teeth, which I mentioned briefly in book 3. And I'm not, you know, the reason that I wrote the books in novel form is to conceal the names and places, the names of real people. I conceal the names of people, I conceal the places, and distances and so on. So there actually isn't anything in the books that would cause the government any problem.
Because they're written in, predominantly because they're written in fictional form rather than you're stating it as fact.
That's correct.
Right.
Yes, and I'm not trying, and I don't name any real names. When I went out on the ranges, I took nothing out there except what the government told me to take out there. When I came off the ranges, I brought nothing off the ranges except my memories. I didn't bring any photographs. I did not bring any logbooks or anything. All that belonged to the government.
Why not join me, Richard D. Hall, live for an evening on board the Starship at the Oaken Gates Theatre in Telford, 11th of May 2011. Or on the 23rd of June at Weston-super-Mare's Grand Atlantic Hotel, and on the 29th of September at the Academy Theatre, Barnsley. In the show, I'll be addressing many of the areas I've covered over the past year, including false flag terrorism, UFOs, animal mutilation, the financial crisis, and more. Learn what your government isn't telling you and what your media isn't allowed to tell you. Find venue and ticket details on the richplanet.net website. Further future venues to be arranged.
When I went out on the ranges, I took nothing out there except what the government told me to take out there. When I came off the ranges, I brought nothing off the ranges except my memories. I didn't bring any photographs. I did not bring any logbooks or anything. All that was belonged to the government. When I left the ranges to go to Vietnam, I packed up only my personal belongings, my brogans, my shoes, and said my prayers and thanked God that I was still alive and headed off for Vietnam in May of '67.
So are you okay to answer, for me to ask you, is this fictional or did this actually happen?
Everything in the books is true and happened to me personally, including Hall photon theory, which is in the appendix of books 3 and books 4. While I was out there, I got to see, I got closer to their propulsion system than any human I know of. I got to see their scout craft, their deep space craft. Their technology their scout craft and their deep space craft are built with a double hull, and in between those two hulls, on the scout craft, there's like 1,000 miles of fiber optic windings, and they're done in different coils. And then the propulsion system generates subatomic particles. There are more force fields generated by the subatomic particles than what Einstein knew about. Einstein and current physicists think that there are only 4 force fields, but when you looked at their coils, as I show in my books, it's a simple matter to show that there have to be at least 7. I could believe there were 19, but I'm certain there are at least 7. And for example, one of the set of coils was an outer set that encompassed their scout craft, which was ellipsoidal, egg-shaped. And when they were just sitting on the desert, powered down, it looked like the fuselage of an airplane. When they powered up, it would fuzz over because that force field interacts with light. Now, I used to watch them when they were totally powered up, lift up off the desert in total silence with no sparks or anything until they were, say, only 20 or 30 feet above the sagebrush, and then move a distance of like 7 miles at an average speed of more than 8,000 miles an hour and stop and then sit down. They could do it so fast that they could do it so fast that your eye couldn't follow them. You know, your eye can't follow an object. So it would seem like they'd gone here and then blinked over there, but really they'd moved that fast. Well, if you tried to do anything like that with a rocket sled, you would liquefy steel. The force of acceleration when they were accelerating was more than 15,000 times the force of gravity. But when they were fuzzed over in that force field, they could just sit there the way we are sitting here today. So they could go and stop because it was moving the whole thing as a unit. And then when they sat down, they would turn down the force field and get off. Well, you need you can't do that with the 4 force fields, see? And I used to, as a weather observer, you're always timing things and measuring distances and stuff, and they could do that in just the most ho-hum fashion. The suits that they wore at night put off a fluorescent light and allowed them to levitate, but they had to balance themselves when they did so. The power pack was up behind the neck on the shoulders where you would think it would be. The children, of course, used to be very athletic, used to be very artistic about it. The older people might only rise up a mere 9 inches and float and stuff. When I first saw them, I thought that I was dreaming, and that's why they called that area Dreamland. Dreamland is not Area 51. Area 51 is Groom Lake. Area 52 is Papoose Lake. Dreamland is another place. And that, when you went out there at first, I thought I was sleepwalking or dreaming, and then I thought I was nuts. Then when I realized that I was looking at real things, then I thought I was hallucinating. I refused to accept that those were real, that there were real people. It was the first 6 months getting used to it was extremely emotional. In my books, if it seems like I'm afraid a lot of the time, that's because the first 6 months I was afraid a lot of the time.
So Charles, have you heard of Bob Lazar?
Yes, I've heard of Bob Lazar.
And what are your thoughts on Bob Lazar?
Well, speaking on camera, I only wish to speak about my own personal experiences or things in the public sector that I've seen. And so I won't make a statement about Bob Lazar because I don't, because I only wish to talk about my personal experiences,
All right.
speaking on camera.
Okay.
Okay.
Now, in your talk, you mentioned a third race, which were small grey aliens, which I think you said that you only saw at a distance and didn't really interact with.
That's correct, the small greys are the children of the adult greys. We have to change our way of thinking if you're going to interact with the aliens. The greys live roughly 150, 200 years, maybe as long as 300, I'm not sure. Well, that means childhood is longer for them. The tall whites likewise. Well, see, they learn to trust their children more than we do. Their children can breathe the air, and their adults cannot. The gray adults need a breathing device, and so it's very seldom that you see the adult grays here on the Earth. They're terrifying. I never want to be around a gray. They're very arrogant. However, the small grays have the saucer-shaped craft run by the small grays. Those are the children on board running the craft. See, the older children and the young teenagers who can still breathe our air. So, for example, the craft that crashed at Roswell, which was a gray craft, did not have adult grays on the craft. It had only older children on the craft or young teenagers. And at Roswell, there were 3 saucers. There was one that crashed on the 2nd of July, and then there were 2 that were out looking for it on the 7th of July, 1947. And see, when an American fighter took up, and they were in search formation, so they'd turned off the outer set of coils, because both the grays and the whites are using a similar approach of having double hulls and fiber optics in between those 2 hulls, and running subatomic particles in those fiber optics. I don't know which ones. And see when they turned off the outer set of coils, they have to drive it like a baby buggy because they can feel the forces of inertia. They can't actually begin high-speed maneuvers until they've fuzzed over, until they've powered up the outer set of coils. Well, when an American F-84 shooting star with live ammunition took up pursuit and asked for permission to begin a live firing pass on the 2 gray saucers, they panicked. Those are children on board who are running the place. Those aren't battle-hardened warriors. They're just young teenagers. And the result, when both craft wanted to power up, because the outer field would protect them from bullets, but powered down it will not. They have no protection from bullets. The craft are very fragile. It was equivalent to the 2 craft crashing into each other. Well, the one on the north wandered off to the north and crashed at Corona. That's the Roswell saucer. Mm-hmm. The one on the south, it wobbled off to the plains of St. Augustine, but it didn't crash in the plains. It crashed on a mountain overlooking the plains. It wasn't found till roughly 1979, and everybody on board had lived for a while but had never been found and died eventually. So the craft they were actually looking for was the craft that was on the plains of St. Augustine, New Mexico. So you see there were 3 craft involved. The first debris field that the Army Air Force went out to look for was where the 2 search craft had in effect crashed into each other by powering up those fields. Those fields extend for a very long way beyond the craft and will protect it from bullets, everything, from anything the fighter plane had. Well, see, that was the first debris field, and that's why the Army Air Force didn't find any of the other craft, because they were looking in the wrong place.
So the Greys then, presumably there were some at the base that you were stationed at?
No, the Greys have their own area, and that's not in my books.
Right.
The tall whites and the Greys are natural enemies, like dogs and cats. In Indian Springs, there are only whites.
Right.
Okay.
So the Greys then, have they been given bases sanctioned by US Black Ops in the same way that the tall whites have?
I don't know.
Right.
Okay, right. I don't know.
And do you know, I've done quite a bit of research into the abduction program, which is allegedly run by the Greys. Can you comment on that at all?
No, I don't. I never want to be around the graves. I would be, see, if I were in Nevada, like if I were up in Mount Charleston or Lee Canyon, and I came across some of my friends, the whites, and since they live 10 times longer than I do, they've only aged 3-4 years versus my 40. See, I wouldn't have any problem talking with my old friends, the tall whites, like the teacher, Range 4 Harry, and so on. I would still observe the same rules. If I saw them, I would stop and stay where I was and let them approach me. I would never pursue. And but see, because they're friendly, they're very much like humans that way. And of course, the Norwegians with 24 teeth, gee, if you weren't a dentist, you couldn't tell the difference between them and us.
It's a very human-like thing.
Yeah, but the Greys, I never want to see the Greys.
Right.
I didn't. I had to for a while, but which I won't go into detail. But there was a time in early '67 when I had to, but I never talked with them. I never made friends with them. I never want to see the Greys again.
Is it true that they can kind of telepathically almost read your thoughts and get in your side your psyche? Or
they're not telepathic. What they are, like the tall whites, their electronics allow them to tell what you're thinking and to place thoughts in your mind. But if you meet one without the electronics, and if they don't speak English, you're strictly back to hand signals. Also, their hearing is at least as good as that of a dog, and their eyesight is at least as good as that of a cat, and their vocal cords allow them to make all those sounds. And so that means that they can stand like in a line, and I speak from direct experience, and they can be talking to themselves in their language, using sounds too high for a human to hear, and they're well aware that's the case, and communicating, and it'll seem like they're telepathic, and really they're just talking to each other using a very high voice. Now, their electronics allow them to put thoughts in your mind, and it's adjustable in volume. It has a limited range. The longest that I ever saw the whites do it on me was at 1.25 miles, and then it sounded like a radio going in and out, losing the signal. But if they're up close and there's several of them and they're all transmitting, it's like being in front of a speaker at a rock session. You can't hear yourself think. It'll be so disruptive. So usually when they came, I preferred that only one of them transmit and the others receive only. But if they were adjusted properly, you could actually hear them talking to each other, as I describe in my books, depending entirely on how their electronics were set, because they could send only, receive only. On one occasion, when Pamela was panicking and talking with the teacher, and she was afraid of me before she had overcome her fears, she was telling the teacher what I had been thinking a couple days before, and I estimate that she must have been receiving my thoughts at a distance of 5 miles. Right. But on that, so they can receive only, and so you're not always sure when they're talking to you.
So do you know how this works, Charles? Is it done through the pineal gland, or the third eye, as they call it? Do you know how it interfaces with the mind?
As I describe in my books, they greatly preferred to have a clear shot at your temple. Either temple would do. But if you were facing them directly, it would still work. But if they had their choice, they would prefer to come around to the right, have somebody come around to the right, and read the thoughts off your temples, where they get a strong signal. However, because it's electronic, it's subject to electrical interference. So, for example, for them, it works best if you're just sitting quietly and not moving your feet or your hands, especially your feet. Because remember how the brain is organized, and I'm not a medical doctor, you have so-called fissures on the brain, and on one side you do the thinking, and on the other side are the cells that control the psychomotors. And if you're moving your feet or arms, then the cells that are running the psychomotors they're putting out signals too and interfering with everything. So it worked best if you could just sit there quietly and let them read your mind. If you were sick, if you were tired, if you were terrified, it did not work at all, because the human mind can think several different ways. Once you panic, the blood flow and the way you think changes the way it works. Or if you're really tired, it'll change the way. So it works best if you're well rested and they can just come in quietly and just read your thoughts that way.
So can they also almost anesthetize you and put you out, as would happen in a typical abduction?
They can easily electronically hypnotize you.
Right.
It's no surprise, virtually every radar engineer for the U.S. Navy that I've ever talked to has a similar story about being up on the radar mast, having the radar mast broadcast, and having the radar waves hypnotize him, you know. One guy was told how he was up on the mast of a destroyer, and one of the antenna from the carrier Enterprise 50 miles away broadcast, and he was in the beam, and it took him 2 hours to get him off because it hypnotized him electronically, kind of locked him up. And so, see, they could do that. They could hypnotize you and unhypnotize you. However, if you understood what was happening, you could break out.
Right.
Many people who are magicians or who are hypnotists, the most common reason, I'm told, for a hypnotist to be sued is because he'll have a subject say and tell him to act like a chicken, and then have everybody laugh, and then unhypnotize and tell him to forget it, and then unhypnotize him, and then the guy will be able to break through that and remember. The trick is to go for the guy who wants to remember that, to go to a very warm place, a comfortable place, and lay down and just let his mind wander and let the brain reconnect the memories. And the first guy that did that that I'm told of, that I've read about, was back in 1925 in Germany. And I describe that in my books as well, and that's what missing time is, because, you know, as I describe in my books, they could come and if they wanted to bring a group of new people around and show them a human, they didn't have to just walk up to you, see? They could wait until you were, like till I'd finished my weather report, my balloon release, and then hypnotize you, and then walk out with the people and do their thing while you're standing there hypnotized, and then you know, then send everybody else away, unhypnotize you, and you'd never know what happened. It's just that it's just that for some reason you couldn't remember what you'd been doing for 20 minutes. See?
This presumably is exactly how they can perform an abduction. This presumably is exactly how they can perform an abduction, which is, you know, many other researchers have.
In my books, I describe how the teacher, who had a little girl, and her little girl didn't have any other little girl playmates. She had boys for playmates, but she liked to take the little girl, the teacher's little girl, to play with a human little girl who lived in Indian Springs. Well, to just play, so the children could play, a perfectly harmless thing. Well, of course, the little girl who lived in Indian Springs was never alone. Her mother was with her. Her father worked nights up at Camp Mercury. And so what the teacher would do is just come in and hypnotize the mother, like when the mother was washing dishes by hand. She would come in and hypnotize her and have her mother just standing there for like 2 hours. And then she would take the human little girl and her little girl out back, and they would play in the swings like kids and have fun, and then she'd bring the human little girl back in, totally unharmed. It was just and put her to sleep and say, don't worry, your mother will wake up here in a minute. Go back and unhypnotize the mother, and then, you know, they would all go away, and the mother would think that she had just gone to the dish sink and washed dishes, and that her mind had kind of fuzzed over, and maybe she'd daydreamed or been singing, and then, you know, and then now happy would go and check on her daughter, see, and so there were, so you know, we only hear about the abductions that and I'm not I want to point out that there's other aspects of the abductions that people never consider, and it's those kinds of, like the one I've described, where really the little girl wasn't being abducted for anything weird. It was because the teacher wanted her little girl to be able to play with the human little girl, for the same reason we take our kids to the park to play.
Okay. And so this electronic device, as you describe it, that presumably that's some kind of psychotronic thing which is added to their biology that's interfaces with them?
It's strictly done with microwaves. They had these little white instruments, and
And if you were to encounter one again today, would you be really scared, or would you?
No, I wouldn't be frightened. They're more frightened of us than we are of them. That's why they use a thing like a, it's like a, it's like a, something like that. And they point it at you and you go docile. It's just like that, it's something like that, they point at you and you go docile.
it's strictly done with microwaves. They had these little white instruments, and I estimated that if we were better at electronics, that many of the things they were doing we could do in less than 100 years, maybe even 20 years, because they were simply better with electronics, and they paid more careful attention to electronics for many things, you see. For example, their scoutcraft. Their scoutcraft was built entirely with parts given them by the U.S. Air Force, and then they assembled them. And you know, when you went on their scoutcraft, the first time I went on the scoutcraft or saw into the scoutcraft, it was really a shock, because like what you saw there were the mold markings from American manufacturers. Like they liked, for example, the tall whites, they're more frail than we are. They like to sleep in hammocks, which they find comfortable. So the U.S. Air Force just went and got a whole bunch of hammocks from cargo masters, cargo hammocks, from the Herky-Bird, you know, off the shelf, and said, here, how many of these do you want? They come in all different sizes, see? And when you looked on their scoutcraft, instead of having bunks where they would lay, they had places for hammocks. And then, you know, they needed a refrigerator. They had a microwave oven, but they didn't want the mechanical door on the microwave oven, so they'd taken off the door had been taken off, and instead an extension had been put on the front of the microwave, and then they'd put more fiber optic windings, very carefully made, around there to generate another force field, so that when you ran the microwaves didn't come out into the room. They would hit that force field and reflect, you see? Well, when you looked at it, there was just, you know, if you knew which subatomic particle they were generating, you could have microwave ovens like that yourself. And it was all done with American-made parts. It's just that they did it, how they did it wasn't necessarily shared with the U.S. Air Force.
Right. So the ETs were kind of specifying small components that they wanted manufacturers, and they were actually assembling them. And
when their deep spacecraft came in, as I describe in Book 3, it came in with the one that came in with meteor damage. It was just barely holding together. They had the way they had designed it. It was about the size of a cruise ship, and it had the standard double hull with the miles of fiber optic windings in between the hulls. Then it had, and after that hull, then it had another hull, and in between those two hulls were storage compartments for food and stuff, and then inside that were where the living quarters were. And when you looked through the windows, it looked like the deck of a cruise ship. There were just decks and stuff, and it had the pilot places up, the place for the pilot and the co-pilot in the front, about 2/3 of the way up. It had the engines in the back, so there were no windows in the back. It did not have windows on top or windows below. The meteor had come through in that storage area. If it had come through just a few feet further into the coils, it had killed them all. Or if it had come further in the living area, but it had come through from the top and blasted a hole more or less 10 feet wide, all the way from the top diagonally down through the bottom. And when they brought that into Indian Springs Valley, and they had the land. There was no way you could have repaired it in space or out in the moon or anywhere. You had to actually get into a place like the Earth where you could take it into a hangar with air pressure and take it apart and put it back together again. Then they asked the Air Force for replacement parts, which included titanium and fiber optics and so on. The Air Force was happy to give them whatever they asked for, and then they went and repaired it in their hangar.
And probably 99.9% of the people who were manufacturing these parts wouldn't even realize it was for an ET craft.
Didn't have the faintest idea. They would just go to any of the aircraft manufacturers and say, I would like 4 door units, you know, or I would like like to an RV manufacturer. When you went on a scout craft, it had a latrine, it had a bathroom and a shower, exactly like any of the RV manufacturers, like Airstream made. It had overhead compartments for storage things, and those were just straight off the shelf.
I just want to quickly ask you about the method of hypnotizing and controlling, as you were describing. Is this a device that they hold in their hand, or is it?
Yes.
Can you describe it, Charles?
It was featureless, but it was like squarish, and it had a certain length. And the power of the weapon there was a relationship between the power of the weapon and its length. So the older ones would be, the older tall whites, they would typically be carrying weapons that were somewhat longer than the ones that the younger ones would be carrying. And the children were never armed, but the adults were always armed. Once they got to be old enough, then they weren't armed anymore. But it was rare to see a tall white, much taller than 8.5 feet, walking by themselves, because by then they were starting to get kind of fragile.
Right.
So usually when you saw a tall white that old, there was almost always a younger person walking next to them to steady them. Although it wouldn't be unusual to see two of them standing alone, like guard duty, because they were so tall they could see. Now their eyes, when they were children, their eyes worked the same as ours. And I love to paint by number, and the children love to come and see my paintings. Art aficionados have nothing to fear from my paintings, because the Van Gogh's record is safe. I'm not much of an artist, but see, as they get as they get older, their eyes become more sensitive. They get to see a little bit more into the ultraviolet and a little bit more into the infrared. This is not unusual. Many humans who are so supposedly colorblind are not defective at all. Many of them just have their genes adjust. Many of them, their genes simply allow them to see somewhat more into the infrared than ordinary people at the expense of visible light. Or one of the rarest kinds of color blindness in humans was discovered here in Britain in World War II. It was a lady, a human lady, who was able to see somewhat into the ultraviolet and somewhat into the infrared, and they discovered she was a person in photo reconnaissance. And the way they discovered it was that she could never be confused by camouflage netting, because she could always pick it out. In order to describe the number of colors that she could naturally see, it was estimated that you needed a color wheel with more than 5,000 colors. Because, see, if she looked at a traffic light, it looked a slightly different color if it was in the summer or if it was in the winter. And see, humans have that quality. Well, the tall whites are the same way. Their eyes naturally see that. So it's not unusual that that's the case. And as they get older, that range broadens. So when I was talking to the teacher, the lady who's interacted with humans as a teacher, as I describe in my books, see, her eyes had already become more sensitive than mine. So when she looked at my paint by color, my paint by number paintings, see, they looked different to her than they did to the children. That's why they wanted to take one of, as I describe in my books, one of my paint by number paintings and take it off somewhere, and it was gone for several months before they returned it, to show it to children, to tall white children at other places, because of the way because only the children could see it the way I saw it, you see?
So what would you say to critics who might say, well, this guy believes everything that he's saying, but he's obviously been taken and been put under mind control, and he's had all of the information that you've just given to me, that's all been programmed into you through some military mind control, and you know that there aren't any ETs. What would you say to someone who tries to explain your story in those terms?
I understand if people don't believe my story. I didn't believe It took me 6 months to accept the existence of the tall whites when they were standing in front of me. But my response to your question is, if that wouldn't be possible. If the U.S. military were that good at mind control, then they would have already solved all sorts of world problems by simply doing it to the world leaders. Right. See, the mere fact that you have a large number of people on this earth that, you know, the Russians, the Chinese, and so on, who think differently than what, say, you know, from what Western diplomats might think, shows that the U.S. that humans, the U.S. military, whatever it is, isn't any good at mind control, or else it would have used it for more things than just putting, you know.
And what about the theory that you've been allowed to talk because they're kind of testing the water, you know what I mean, putting you out there to gauge public reaction to somebody giving this information, so that the information's all true? Or do you think it's purely because you've told it as a fictional story that they're okay with that?
I can only speculate. I note that the agreement that I had said that I could always tell anyone anything because nothing that I did was ever classified. I also note that the tall whites themselves that I spoke with were not in favor of keeping their existence secret. They thought that the U.S. military should just tell the world that they were here and they were friendly, right. and they themselves weren't in favor of all the secrecy. However, they were happy to make that agreement with the U.S. military. Right. And lastly, from the point of view of the U.S. military, you know, the focus of my books is not military policy or government policy. The focus of my books is my own personal emotional experiences, and I can only speculate, as other people, regarding, you know, what the military motive might be. I'm happy that I'm happy to tell my story. It wouldn't surprise me if the military wasn't, or if the U.S. government or the Western nations weren't trying to slowly break the news to the people of the world. But that's not what I'm about. What I'm about is trying to explain to my children and grandchildren the emotions that I felt. I'll give you one. When my friend Kenneth E. Baker came to me and said that he was willingly going to die to keep me alive. What I'm trying to explain in the books, I'm a very religious person. I'm Roman Catholic, my wife and I, and we're a very religious person. And he was a better man than me. I would have willingly died in Vietnam to keep him alive. And I'm trying, in the books, for example, I'm trying to explain the emotion of how that felt. And I was trying to say to Ken, no, you know, you're the one that needs to go home. And he was saying, and he was like a brother. He was saying, no, God didn't give me the power, me, Charlie, the power to decide. God gave him the power to decide, and he called for his own name, and that he would die for me. And I'm trying to explain how emotional that was. And then later, when he died in a communist attack in the early spring in the Tet Offensive of 1968, how emotional that was. I went around for a week. I was so upset. I didn't care if I lived or died in Vietnam for a week. And then I sat down one day, and I decided, I was praying, and I decided that I had to be the person that he died to keep alive, the person with a sense of humor and so on. Otherwise, his sacrifice wouldn't mean anything. And see, it's those emotions I'm trying to put into the book. I really am not focused on, or I really don't care. I'm not trying to change anything the government has decided or whatever it might be about.
All right, then, Charles. Well, on that very emotional note, I'd like to thank you for coming to England and sharing all of this with you know, people in England. You know, it's absolutely phenomenal story, and we're really looking forward to you speaking this afternoon, because you're speaking again this afternoon, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So good luck with that, and again, thank you for you and your wife for doing this interview. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on your show. It's a great honor for me, and I wish only the best for the people of England.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Charles.
Okay. 50 miles up there. The base is dug in on those mountains, and the Air Force runs that whole section of desert. It's the back door to Area 51. However, it is not itself. It's inside the Area 51 perimeter, but you know, you can the valley is very long, and as you see on the map, very wide. And it's at the northern end of that valley. They've been there for a very long time. The tall whites live much longer than we do. The tall whites live, I estimate, 600 to 800 years. They live about 10 times longer than we do. But they don't age the way we do. When they get to be equivalent to a human, about 40, instead of showing the effects of age, they start growing again. So that throughout most of their life, they're the same height I am, 5'11", but they're all individuals, so there's variation. And then, but then when as they get older, they get very tall. I've seen them more than 8.5 and 9 feet tall, but the very old ones get very fragile because their organs do not grow in the same proportion as their skeleton and their muscles. Eventually they get so old and so tall that their organs can no longer support their body, and they die of old age. This is not necessarily, in the 60s, before the internet and computers, you had to have a person actually go out and measure the winds and look at the clouds and send in wind reports. My job, and plot up weather maps and so on. I was stationed at Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada, outside Las Vegas, Nevada, and from 1965 till May of 1967. And of that time, I spent most of it at the Indian Springs gunnery ranges, northwest of Nellis. They're like 90 miles. Nevada is a big stretch of desert, and it was out in the Indian Springs Valley, which is a desert valley covered with mountains. I discovered that as the weather observer, it was my duty to get up at 3 in the morning and go out to drive out into the desert and release a weather balloon and track it and phone the winds into Nellis. I discovered that at the north end of Indian Springs Valley there is a base that the U.S. Air Force has for extraterrestrials. I named those extraterrestrials the Tall Whites. I described that 2-year stretch that I was out there in my 4-book series, which I've entitled Millennial Hospitality. I have a website, millennialhospitality.com. I'm also millennialhospitality.org, and which has pictures and more information, and in women's fashions. And I had mail order catalogs for Montgomery Wards and Sears and so on. And many times, or if I was talking about their children, about how healthy their children were. So they weren't, it was, what I'm trying to capture in my books is the shock of it all. I'm also trying to capture the difference between talking with the extraterrestrials and talking with my experiences with my guardian angels. So the books have more than just extraterrestrial things in them. When I was in Vietnam, my good friend Kenneth E. Baker from LaPorte, Texas, willingly gave his life to keep me alive. And so in book 3, there's this large section where I try to capture how that felt, how it was with Baker. It was a very religious experience for him to come and say that he was that he knew in advance that he was going to die to keep me alive. So they're a very emotional series of books.
So Charles, I just want to ask you about the actual base. So
yes.
Presumably this base was provided by US Black Ops under kind of a veil of secrecy, is that?
When you're on the public highway at Indian Springs, Nevada, which everyone can find in the maps. And as my website shows, when you look north up the valley, there's a group of mountains that are like 40.
Today I've travelled to Lytham St Anne's and I've been attending the Probe UK Paranormal and UFO Conference, and I'm delighted to speak with Charles Hall, who is a Vietnam vet. He has a master's in nuclear physics and he has had some phenomenal experiences in Nevada. Charles, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Now, I would just ask viewers to keep an open mind when listening to Charles. He's a very eloquent man, as we found out yesterday when we listened to his talk. Now, if you just start with your, because you were a weather observer, could you tell us what that's about and why do we need weather observers?
Well, thank you for having me on your show. I enlisted in the U.S. Air Force in July 1964, and making a very long story short, I became a weather observer. I was trained to be a weather observer. Books can be purchased anywhere in the world through Amazon.com or at any bookstore. I tried, in my books, I'm not trying to prove that the extraterrestrials are real. For the first 6 months that I came across them, I thought I was nuts. I refused to accept that I was looking at real flesh and blood creatures who had come here from some planet orbiting a distant star. And so even with them standing in front of me, I found it hard to accept. Took me 6 months to get over the terror and the shock, and what I'm trying to describe in my books is how it felt. I'm trying to describe how that felt for 2 years to go out into the desert knowing that you weren't going to be alone, or having the extraterrestrials come into my barracks at Indian Springs. It was a very tiny base. And, waking up at night with them there. After 2 years, I stopped questioning myself and made friends with a few of them. Each one of them is individuals, just like humans. Their skin is as white as a piece of paper. They have large blue eyes, and throughout most of their life, they stand as tall as we do. I describe all that in my books. They have men, women, and children. And you'd talk, most of the time when you were talking with them, I was talking about very ordinary things, such as if I was talking with the young mothers, they were interested